This HOA Karen called 911 on my illegal lakeside cabin, clueless that I own the dock permits her $50 million neighborhood needs to survive. At 6 a.m., I'm sipping coffee on my Lake Clearwater dock when a cop car rolls up, trailed by Linda in designer athleisure, shrieking about my grandfather's 75-year-old cabin destroying property values. She's hit me with $2,500, 0 cents in fake fines, assuming a 30-year electrician can't read property law. But my 1947 deed legally controls every single dock in her precious community, and she's been illegally collecting fees for decades. Tonight, I'm revoking every dock permit and exposing 30 years of fraud in front of the entire neighborhood. Ever fantasized about absolutely obliterating an HOA dictator? Drop your wildest revenge dreams below. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Jake Morrison, I'm 52, and until recently, I was just a retired electrician trying to put my life back together after a pretty messy divorce. You know how it is, sometimes you need a project to keep your hands busy while your heart heals. 8 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's fishing cabin on Lake Clearwater, Michigan. Now this wasn't some fancy lakefront property. We're talking about a genuine 1,940s fishing shack that Grandpa built with his own hands right after he got back from the war. The place smelled like cedar shavings and old varnish, had more character than a Hemingway novel, and sat on the prettiest little piece of shoreline you ever saw. My plan was simple: restore the cabin on weekends, maybe rent it out to fishermen, teach my grandson how to cast a line, where 4 generations of Morrison men had learned the same skill. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. That's when I met Linda Ashworth. Linda's 48, drives a white Mercedes SUV that's always spotless, and happens to be the president of something called the Clearwater Shores Premium Community. That's the HOA that sprouted up around the lake back in 1995, full of McMansions worth $800,000 each. Linda's got that real estate background, married to a bank VP, and she's got that particular smile. You know the one I'm talking about, sweet as pie until she doesn't get her way. The first time we met, I was out on the dock sanding down some weathered planks, feeling those smooth river rocks under my boots where Grandpa had built his little pathway. The morning sun was just hitting the water, and I had that perfect moment of peace you only get on a lake at sunrise. Then I heard the click, click, click of heels on dock planks. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Linda chirped, but her eyes were already cataloging everything she didn't like about my place. I stood up, wiped the sawdust off my hands, and tried to be neighborly. "Morning, ma'am. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Oh yes, gorgeous," she said, then immediately shifted gears. "I'm Linda Ashworth, HOA president. I wanted to chat with you about bringing your property up to community standards." Now, I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's trying to play me. The way she said property, like it was a dirty word, the fake smile that didn't reach her eyes, I knew I was dealing with a professional. "Well, Linda, I appreciate the concern, but this cabin was built in 1947, long before any HOA existed." I pulled out the original building permit from my back pocket. I'd started carrying it after some of the neighbors had been giving me funny looks. "Everything's legal and grandfathered." That's when her mask slipped just a little. "That old shack doesn't belong here anymore. Our community has standards, and frankly, it's bringing down everyone's property values." I kept my voice calm and steady. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation." She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume mixing with the morning lake air. "Oh, I understand perfectly. You have 2 choices. Bring that cabin up to our community standards, or we'll find a way to remove it. This is a premium neighborhood, Mr. Morrison, and we intend to keep it that way." Now here's the thing about people like Linda. They're used to folks backing down when they throw their weight around. They count on intimidation and the assumption that regular people can't fight back against their lawyers and connections and HOA boards. But what Linda didn't know was that my grandfather wasn't just a fisherman. He was the kind of man who read every contract, kept every receipt, and never threw away a document that might matter someday. And he'd taught me that patience and preparation beat bluster and threats every single time. "Linda," I said, taking a sip of my coffee while watching a great blue heron fish in the shallows, "I think you're about to learn something interesting about this old place." Linda didn't waste any time making good on her threat. 3 days after our little dock conversation, I got a surprise visit from the county building department. I was installing new cleats on the dock when this inspector pulled up, clipboard in hand and a sour expression that suggested he'd already made up his mind about what he was going to find. "Jake Morrison, I'm here about a complaint filed regarding unpermitted structures on this property. The complaint came on official HOA letterhead signed by Linda herself, claiming my cabin violated lake setback requirements and had numerous unpermitted modifications that pose a danger to the community. The inspector walked around taking photos, but funny thing, he only seemed interested in the rough exterior of the cabin, not the solid foundation or the meticulous restoration work I'd been doing. Now here's where Linda made her first big mistake. See, when you spend 30 years as an electrician, you learn a thing or two about permits and inspections. You also learn to keep your paperwork organized and your documentation bulletproof. I walked over to my truck and pulled out Grandpa's old metal filing box, the same olive green military surplus container he'd used to store important documents since 1947. The hinges creaked as I opened it, and the smell of old paper and decades of memories drifted out. Inspector, before you write up that report, you might want to take a look at these. I spread out the original survey maps, the 1947 building permits, and correspondence between Grandpa and the county from when he built the place. Every single document was pristine, organized chronologically, and stamped with official seals. The inspector's attitude changed faster than a Michigan weather front. "Sir, your paperwork's actually better than most new construction I see." That's when I mentioned something I'd noticed during my morning coffee sessions on the porch. "You know, Inspector, while you're here checking setbacks, you might want to measure some of those newer properties. I think you'll find that several HOA houses have deck extensions that push right over their property lines, including Linda's. Her deck, the one where she liked to hold her little wine and gossip sessions, extended a full 3 feet onto what was technically easement property. The inspector added it to his violation list that same afternoon. Let me share something I learned from all those years pulling permits. Grandfathered properties often have stronger legal standing than newer developments. Always research original permits and surveys before making accusations. Linda received her violation notice the same day I got my clean inspection report. Turns out her pristine deck needed either a $15,000 0-cents engineering report or complete removal to comply with current setback rules. The sound of her Mercedes engine overheating in my driveway that evening was almost as satisfying as the taste of the base I'd caught and fried up for dinner. But Linda wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That weekend, my neighbor, Earl, a 78-year-old retired machinist who'd known Grandpa, stopped by with a 6-pack of Budweiser and some stories I hadn't heard before. "Your granddad was smart as a whip," Earl said, settling into one of the old Adirondack chairs on my porch. "He knew they'd eventually try to develop this lake, so he made sure to protect what mattered." Meanwhile, Linda was busy launching her social media campaign. A Facebook group called Protecting Our Community Standards popped up overnight, complete with photos of my cabin taken from unflattering angles and captions about preserving property values. She had a gift for making restoration work look like destruction, progress look like decay. I didn't engage with any of it. Social media drama wasn't my style, and besides, I had more important things to focus on, like the growing stack of historical documents I was discovering every time I went through Grandpa's papers. A few newer residents started whispering support when they'd see me at the hardware store, but they wouldn't speak up publicly. I understood. Nobody wants to make enemies with the HOA president, especially when you're still paying a mortgage. But the old-timers, they remembered. They remembered when this lake was about fishing and peace and quiet before it became about property values and community standards. And they started remembering out loud. Linda's deck violation was just the beginning. Funny how regulations work both ways, isn't it? When you start demanding strict enforcement of every rule and setback, sometimes you discover that glass houses and stone throwing don't mix well. The sound of my cordless drill echoing across the water during those evening dock repairs became a kind of meditation. Each screw I tightened, each board I replaced, was another step toward honoring Grandpa's legacy, and another nail in Linda's assumption that I'd just roll over and disappear. But I could feel the storm building. Linda wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not after being embarrassed by her own violation notice. If anything, I'd just made her more dangerous. Linda's response to the deck violation was swift and predictable. She doubled down. Hard. Within a week, every HOA member received a formal notice about an emergency meeting to address non-conforming structures threatening our community. She'd invited her tennis partner, City Councilman Bradley Walsh, to discuss what she called urgent property enforcement concerns. The meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday night, and Linda came prepared with a PowerPoint presentation that would have made a corporate lawyer proud. She had charts about property values, photos of my cabin from the most unflattering angles possible, and a proposed special assessment to hire specialized legal counsel for property enforcement. Translation: she wanted every homeowner to cough up money so she could hire a lawyer to come after me. The kicker? She was circulating a petition demanding I either remove the cabin entirely or pay a $50,000 0 cents compliance fine to bring it up to what she called community standards. While Linda was busy playing politics, I was playing detective. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse, that beautiful old brick building with the musty basement records room that smells like decades of forgotten paperwork. I spent the better part of 3 days down there, going through property records that dated back to the 1920s, tracing every deed, every easement, every scrap of legal documentation related to Lake Clearwater. The courthouse coffee from the vending machine tasted like burnt rubber, but I barely noticed. I was too busy discovering something that made my hand shake as I held those brittle 1940S documents in their protective sleeves. See, I knew Grandpa had sold off most of his lakefront property to developers back in 1994. What I didn't know was the specific conditions he'd negotiated into that sale. Buried in the original easement deed was a clause that changed everything. Grandpa hadn't just retained access to the dock, he'd retained ownership of the actual dock structure itself, selling only usage rights to the development company. Every single boat slip that HOA residents were renting for $200 0 cents a month, it required written permission from the Morrison family designee. That would be me. Linda had been collecting dock fees without legal authority for years. I sat there in that basement records room, listening to my footsteps echo on the marble courthouse steps as I walked back to my truck and realized I was holding a nuclear weapon disguised as yellowed paperwork. But I'm not the type to go nuclear without giving diplomacy a chance. I made an appointment with the HOA's attorney, a sharp-dressed guy in his 50s who probably billed more per hour than I used to make in a week. I walked into his mahogany-paneled office with a manila folder and a calm expression. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're having some disputes with the HOA board." "Not disputes exactly," I said, sliding the easement deed across his polished desk. "More like clarifications." I watched his face go pale as he read through the document. Then he read it again. Then he reached for his reading glasses and read it a third time. "This is actually ironclad." "I'm not looking for trouble," I told him, meaning every word. "I just want to restore my cabin in peace. But I thought you should inform Mrs. Ashworth about the dock ownership situation before things escalate any further." The attorney nodded slowly, probably calculating billable hours and liability exposure. I'll need to discuss this with the board immediately. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when that word involves lawyers going pale and emergency phone calls. Earl stopped by that evening with updates from the old-timer network. "Hardware store owner says Linda tried to get you banned from buying supplies," he chuckled, settling into his usual chair on my porch. "Marina owner mentioned she's been claiming dock ownership for insurance purposes." The feel of those worn documents in my hands, the smell of old paper and legal consequence, the sound of Linda's carefully constructed world starting to crack, it was all building towards something bigger than either of us had imagined. Linda's initial response was pure denial. "Some old papers don't override modern property law," she told anyone who'd listen. But privately, according to Earl's sources, she was panicking about the potential financial liability for all those dock fees she'd been collecting. Here's what I learned about easement rights that every property owner should know. Easement and usage rights can override HOA authority. Always check original development agreements before purchasing waterfront property. By the end of the week, Linda was telling people we'd fight this in court if necessary. She was doubling down, again, just like I expected. But what she didn't realize was that I was just getting started. And unlike her threats and bluster, everything I had was backed up by decades of careful documentation and legal precedent. The dock fees were just the tip of the iceberg. Linda's desperation was starting to show, and desperate people make sloppy mistakes. Her next move was to claim my dock repairs violated historical waterfront preservation. which was rich, considering her neighborhood had paved over half the natural shoreline for their boat slips. She filed a complaint with the state environmental agency, alleging I was making unpermitted lake modifications that threatened the ecosystem. She also rallied the HOA board to threaten a lawsuit for diminished property values, though half the board was starting to look uncomfortable with her increasingly aggressive tactics. And then there were the rumors. Linda started spreading whispers about my suspicious daily activities at the cabin. According to the coffee shop gossip network, I was either running some kind of illegal business, hiding assets from my divorce, or, my personal favorite, operating a meth lab disguised as a fishing cabin. I responded the way Grandpa taught me, methodically and with documentation. Every interaction got photographed and time-stamped. Every conversation got recorded on my phone. Perfectly legal in Michigan, as long as one party knows about it. When my tools started mysteriously disappearing from the cabin, I installed a security camera system that would make a casino proud. The environmental inspector's visit was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and I made sure to be there bright and early with fresh coffee and every environmental permit known to mankind. "Mr. Morrison, I'm here about potential wetland violations." "Absolutely, Inspector. Coffee?" What Linda hadn't bothered to research was that Grandpa had actually filed a voluntary conservation easement back in 1952, protecting more shoreline than current regulations required. The cabin's environmental footprint was smaller than a suburban garage, and every modification I'd made actually improved water quality by replacing old materials with eco-friendly alternatives. Meanwhile, the inspector noticed that 3 HOA properties had recently landscaped right up to the water's edge with non-native plants and chemical fertilizers, a clear violation of current wetland protection rules. "Ma'am," the inspector told Linda when she showed up an hour later, expecting vindication, "your community is the one with environmental violations, not Mr. Morrison." But the real revelation came from my security cameras. The first footage showed Linda's teenage son spray painting "Go Home" on the side of my cabin at 2 a.m. The second showed Linda herself, dressed in dark clothes, removing the property markers I'd installed to mark the boundaries. But the third piece of footage was the most damning. Linda meeting with a man I didn't recognize, handing him what looked like cash, and pointing toward my cabin. I didn't call the police, not yet. Instead, I shared the footage with the HOA attorney as documentation of ongoing harassment. Let him figure out the legal implications. The smell of evening campfire smoke drifted across the water as I installed motion-activated floodlights around the cabin perimeter. The sound of loons calling in the distance provided a peaceful soundtrack to my security preparations, while the taste of justice brewing felt sweeter than my morning coffee. My alliance was growing too. Earl introduced me to other pre-HOA property owners who had their own Linda stories. The local fishing guides started referring customers to me for lake access. Even the county inspector had become an informal ally after discovering Linda's pattern of false reports. "She's filed 17 complaints in 2 years, he told me off the record. 16 were baseless. We're starting to flag her calls." Linda's public relations campaign was getting more desperate by the day. She organized a community safety meeting about transient cabin dwellers. Apparently, I was now transient despite owning the property. She contacted her book club friend at the local newspaper, spinning tales about suspicious activities and declining neighborhood safety. The next-door posts were particularly creative. According to Linda's version of reality, I was simultaneously running a business without permits, operating dangerous equipment at all hours, hosting unsavory characters, and somehow threatening the welfare of children just by existing. She even tried to pressure the marina into revoking my boat launch privileges, claiming I was creating a hostile environment for families. Here's a security tip I learned the hard way. Security cameras on your own property can legally document harassment and trespassing. Keep footage organized with timestamps for potential legal use. Through it all, I maintained what my grandfather would have called strategic patience. I continued the cabin restoration, documenting every step. I built relationships with reasonable community members. I let Linda overplay her hand while I gathered evidence. The feel of smooth river rocks under my boots as I rebuilt Grandpa's pathway. The sound of my tools working steadily while Linda's schemes grew more frantic. The taste of determination mixed with morning lake mist. Everything was building toward a confrontation I could see coming like a storm front across the water. But Linda had no idea what she was actually up against, because while she was busy playing petty power games, I was uncovering secrets that would change everything. The real bombshell was still locked away in Grandpa's crawl space, waiting to be discovered. The discovery happened on a rainy Saturday morning while I was insulating the cabin's crawl space. I had been putting off that particular job because crawl spaces rank somewhere between root canals and tax audits on my list of favorite activities. I was lying on my back, flashlight in one hand and insulation in the other, when my elbow knocked against something metal wedged between two floor joists. It took some maneuvering, but I managed to work loose a second metal box, smaller than the first one, but just as carefully preserved. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like some kind of pirate treasure, was a document that made me sit up so fast I nearly cracked my skull on a beam. The original 1994 sale contract between Grandpa and Clearwater Development Corporation. But not just any contract, this was the master agreement, with clauses I'd never seen before. My hands were actually shaking as I read through the legal language, and it wasn't from the cold, crawl space air. Grandpa hadn't just retained dock ownership, he'd retained approval authority over every single water permit on the entire lake. Every boat dock, every seawall, every water structure in the HOA development required written consent from the Morrison family designee or heir. That would be me. Linda and her neighbors had been operating under fraudulent permits for 30 years. I climbed out of that crawl space and sat at Grandpa's old kitchen table, reading the contract over and over, while rain drummed on the tin roof. The scope of it was breathtaking. Grandpa had essentially created a legal mechanism to prevent overdevelopment of the lake, disguised as a simple property sale. The next morning, I drove straight to my attorney's office. "This is extraordinary leverage," he said after reviewing the documents for 20 minutes. "You could legally revoke all dock privileges immediately. Every property sale requiring dock access would need your approval. You could charge market rate fees for dock usage. We're talking $400, 0 cents per month per slip, minimum." He ran some quick calculations. Conservative estimate, your approval rights are worth over $2 million to this community. But here's the thing, going nuclear would hurt innocent homeowners who'd bought their properties in good faith, elderly retirees who'd saved their whole lives for lakefront retirement, young families who just wanted a safe place to raise their kids. That wasn't justice, that was just revenge. I sat on the dock that evening, watching the sunset paint the water gold and orange, processing the magnitude of what Grandpa had done. He'd protected this lake through legal cleverness, not vindictiveness. He'd given his descendants the power to preserve what mattered without destroying what was good. The loons were calling across the water, their voices echoing off the hills, like they had for generations before the McMansions, before the HOA, before Linda's petty power games. This was bigger than dock fees or property values or community standards. This was about stewardship. I made my decision sitting there with my coffee growing cold and the stars beginning to appear. I would use this leverage for reasonable resolution, not financial gain. Force Linda's resignation, establish peaceful coexistence, protect the lake for future generations. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Linda's entire authority was built on illegally collected fees and fraudulent permits. The community's property values actually depended on my goodwill, not her threats. But she didn't know that yet. Here's what every waterfront property buyer should understand. Original property developers sometimes retain hidden control mechanisms. Thoroughly review all historical documents before purchasing. Run a non-optional, non-seasonal history, or do all the clerks in the office have Down syndrome? The next phase would require careful planning, trusted allies, and perfect timing, because when you're holding a legal nuclear weapon, the hardest part isn't using it. It's using it wisely. The planning phase required the kind of methodical preparation that would make a military strategist proud. I wasn't just building a legal case, I was orchestrating the complete reformation of a community power structure. Earl became my unofficial campaign manager, stopping by every evening with intelligence from the old-timer network. Turns out, when you've lived somewhere for 50 years, you know where all the bodies are buried. Linda borrowed against her dock permit for a home equity loan last year, he told me over coffee one morning, settling into what had become his regular chair on my porch. Bank required proof of permanent water access for the loan approval. That was leverage I could use. The marina owner, Dave, provided insider knowledge about dock permit irregularities. He'd been keeping records of who paid what to whom, and Linda's bookkeeping was creative, to put it politely. Some residents were paying her directly, others through the HOA, and nobody had any idea who actually owned what. My county inspector friend, let's call him Mike, shared off-the-record information about Linda's violation history. 90% of her complaints had been baseless, and she'd started getting flagged as a frequent complaint source by multiple agencies. "We're required to investigate every report," Mike told me. "But between you and me, when we see her name on a complaint, we roll our eyes first." My attorney drafted a comprehensive response package that would make the Supreme Court proud. Every threat Linda had made, every false claim, every piece of harassment, all documented with legal precision and backed by ironclad historical evidence. The settlement proposal was elegant in its simplicity. I would grant permanent dock easements to all current residents in exchange for formal recognition of my cabin's protected status, and Linda's immediate resignation from any position of authority over lake matters. The financial analysis was staggering. Linda's HOA had collected approximately $180,000, 0 cents in Logilo dock fees, over the past 5 years. In today's market, similar lake access rights sold for $500,000, 0 cents, and up. Conservative estimate, my approval rights were worth over $2 million, 0 cents to the community. But I wasn't interested in the money, I was interested in the principle. Local fishing guides rallied to provide testimony about the cabin's historical importance and minimal environmental impact. These were guys who'd been taking clients to this lake for decades, who remembered when it was about fishing and peace instead of property values and social status. The technical preparation felt like preparing for a doctoral defense. I organized all documents chronologically in professional binders, created a visual timeline of property history that any layperson could understand, and prepared environmental impact assessments showing the cabin's footprint was smaller than most community garages. I documented every instance of Linda's harassment with timestamps, witnesses, and photographic evidence. The pattern was clear: escalating intimidation designed to force me out through legal costs and community pressure. The psychological preparation was just as important. I practiced calm, factual presentation in the mirror, preparing for Linda's likely emotional outbursts and personal attacks. I knew she'd try to make it about class, about outsiders, about anything except the actual legal facts. Late at night, sitting in Grandpa's old leather chair with the smell of wood polish and decades of pipe tobacco still lingering in the fabric, I'd review contracts and practice my responses to common HOA talking points. The sound of papers rustling mixed with the distant calls of night birds on the lake. My timing strategy was crucial. I'd wait for Linda to call another emergency meeting. Her pattern suggested she couldn't resist the dramatic gesture. I'd attend as a regular community member, let her present her case first, then systematically dismantle every claim with documented evidence. The community benefit planning was where everything came together. Using the dock fees Linda had been collecting, I designed a proposal for a lake conservation fund that would benefit everyone. Annual water quality testing, invasive species removal, a scholarship program for local kids interested in environmental science. I even sketched out plans for dock improvements that would serve the entire community while honoring Grandpa's conservation intentions. Modern materials, environmentally friendly design, better accessibility for elderly residents. Here are the knowledge nuggets that could help anyone facing similar situations. Property research. County courthouse records often reveal hidden easements and rights that predate modern developments. Document preservation. Store important papers in fireproof, waterproof containers. You never know when historical documents might become legal game changers. Legal leverage. Sometimes the best defense is discovering you don't need to defend anything. You actually hold all the cards. The taste of morning coffee mixed with the satisfaction of thorough preparation. The feel of organized documents under my hands. The sound of a plan coming together like the steady rhythm of waves on the shore. I was ready for whatever Linda threw at me next, because when you've got both the moral high ground and legal superiority, patience becomes your greatest weapon. Linda's desperation reached new heights when she discovered I'd been meeting with an attorney. Her spies in the old-timer network weren't as reliable as she thought, but word eventually got back to her that I wasn't just playing defense anymore. Her response was swift and nuclear. She called an emergency HOA board meeting to authorize a $100,000 0 cents legal defense fund, money that would come from a special assessment requiring each homeowner to cough up $3,000, 0 cents, for what she called community protection against frivolous litigation. The panic she spread was masterful in its manipulation. That cabin owner could destroy all our property values, she told anyone who'd listen. We need to show a united front before he bankrupts us all with lawsuits. 3 homeowners received notices that same week, demanding immediate payment, with threats of liens on their properties if they refused. That's when Linda crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Meanwhile, my security cameras were capturing behavior that would make a criminal lawyer salivate. First, there was Linda's landscaper, a guy I later learned she paid in cash, dumping yard waste and construction debris near my cabin at midnight. The footage was crystal clear, license plate, face, everything. When I called the landscaper the next day, he immediately threw Linda under the bus. Lady paid me $200 to make it look like your place was attracting trash, he admitted. Said it was for insurance purposes. Then came the bureaucratic harassment campaign. Mysterious complaints started flowing to every agency imaginable: health department, fire department, zoning, environmental protection. Each complaint required an inspection. Each inspection cost me time and money, and each inspector found absolutely nothing wrong. The pattern was so obvious that even the bureaucrats started getting annoyed. Same handwriting on all the complaints, one inspector muttered, showing me 3 different forms, supposedly from different residents. Linda even managed to get my boat launch access temporarily revoked by pressuring the marina owner. She claimed I was creating a hostile environment for families and threatened to organize a boycott of his business if he didn't cooperate. But Linda's biggest mistake was escalating to sabotage. My cameras caught her teenage son again, this time with 2 friends, attempting to cut the dock lines on my fishing boat. More damaging was the footage of Linda herself at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, removing property markers I'd installed after the survey. The most incriminating footage showed Linda meeting with a man I didn't recognize, handing him what was clearly cash and pointing toward my cabin while making gestures that looked distinctly threatening. I didn't call the police immediately. Instead, I took the footage to the HOA attorney as additional documentation of escalating harassment. His face went white when he saw Linda caught red-handed, destroying property markers. Mr. Morrison, I need to strongly advise my client to cease all contact with you and your property. But Linda was beyond listening to legal advice. She'd reached that point where pride and panic override common sense. She organized what she called a community safety patrol, basically a group of volunteers who followed me around the lake during my fishing trips, taking invasive photos and documenting my suspicious activities. Suspicious activities like fishing and dock maintenance, and enjoying morning coffee on my own porch. The harassment got so blatant that she actually filed for a restraining order, claiming I'd threatened her during our grocery store encounter. Problem was, my phone had been recording the entire conversation, proving that our interaction consisted of me saying, "Good morning, Linda," and her responding with a 5-minute rant about property values. The judge dismissed her restraining order request and issued a warning about filing false reports. Here's something every property owner should know. Document all harassment incidents with timestamps and witnesses. Patterns of false reporting can backfire legally on the perpetrator. The community was starting to fracture along predictable lines. 3 HOA board members quietly resigned rather than support Linda's increasingly unhinged campaign. Several homeowners refused to pay the special assessment without seeing actual legal justification. Earl's intelligence network reported that Linda's husband was suggesting she take a vacation until things calmed down. Apparently his bank was getting uncomfortable with the negative publicity surrounding his wife's crusade. The sound of my power tools during evening cabin restoration had become a kind of meditation, steady, purposeful, unstoppable. The smell of fresh pine boards replacing rotted siding mixed with the taste of inevitable justice in the crisp autumn air. But Linda wasn't done. Her final escalation was coming, and I could feel it building like a storm front across the water. When people like Linda realize they're losing control, they don't retreat gracefully. They double down one last time, usually with spectacular results. I was ready for whatever came next. My documentation was complete, My legal position was unassailable, and my patience was about to pay off in ways Linda couldn't imagine. The only question was whether she'd destroy herself before I had to reveal what I actually held in my hand. Linda's final escalation was like watching someone throw gasoline on a fire while standing too close to the flames. It started with attempted bribery. Actual honest-to-God bribery. My county inspector friend Mike called me personally to report that Linda had approached him after a community event, offering what she called a consulting fee if he could find code violations at my cabin. She pulled out an envelope with cash, Jake, right there in the parking lot of the Methodist church. Said it was payment for thorough inspection services. Mike reported the incident to the county ethics office that same afternoon. Next, Linda tried to buy off the marina owner with an exclusive HOA contract worth $50,000 0 cents annually if he permanently banned me from using the boat launch. Dave recorded the entire conversation on his phone and played it back for me over coffee that evening. She actually said we need to make his life so difficult that he just gives up and leaves, Dave chuckled, shaking his head. Lady doesn't realize that kind of thing is a legal conspiracy. But Linda's desperation reached peak crazy when she contacted environmental group with fabricated claims about me, polluting the lake with illegal runoff. She doctored photos to make my restoration materials look like industrial waste and submitted them to 3 different agencies. The environmental group investigators arrived expecting to find an ecological disaster. Instead, they discovered that Linda's own property had multiple violations: fertilizer runoff, non-native landscaping right up to the water's edge, and a decorative fountain that was illegally drawing lake water without proper permits. The intimidation campaign expanded beyond me to anyone who'd shown me support. Linda started threatening neighbors who'd been friendly, with HOA violations for minor infractions, mailbox placement, garden borders, even the color of front door paint. That backfired spectacularly. Nothing turns reasonable people against a tyrant faster than watching them abuse their power against innocent folks. My anonymous support network grew stronger in response to Linda's overreach. Someone left fresh vegetables from their garden on my cabin porch every morning. Another mystery supporter paid my marina fees when Linda got them canceled through pressure tactics. The hardware store owner quietly upgraded my materials orders at no charge. Most of us are rooting for you, read an unsigned note tucked under my windshield wiper. Don't let her win. Linda's public behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged. Earl witnessed her screaming match with an HOA board member at the post office. Something about traitors undermining community security. She threatened to sue the local newspaper for biased reporting, even though they'd only reported verified facts. Her husband's quiet suggestion that she take a vacation got louder and more urgent as Linda's crusade attracted the wrong kind of attention from his bank's board of directors. The investigation momentum was building beyond Linda's control. The newspaper's research had uncovered systematic permit irregularities throughout the HOA. The county began auditing all of Linda's filed complaints, finding 90% were baseless. The state environmental agency opened a formal file on Linda for repeated false reporting. Even the sheriff's department flagged Linda's address as a frequent complaint source after she'd called them 17 times in 2 months about various suspicious activities that all turned out to be perfectly legal. My final preparations were methodical and comprehensive. Every document was organized in professional binders. Every piece of harassment was documented with timestamps and witnesses. My security system was upgraded to live stream capability both for protection and evidence preservation. My attorney confirmed that our documentation package was court-ready and bulletproof. My community allies were prepared to testify about Linda's harassment patterns if needed. Local media contacts were established for post-revelation coverage. But the most important preparation was psychological. I sat on Grandpa's dock during the evening hours, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, processing the responsibility that came with the power I held. The taste of autumn air mixed with wood smoke from someone's fireplace, the sound of geese calling overhead as they headed south for winter, the feel of solid dock planks under my feet, planks that I now knew belonged to me, not the HOA. Linda was setting up her own destruction with surgical precision. The perfect storm was building as she called for one final emergency HOA meeting to resolve the cabin situation permanently. She promised to reveal shocking truths about my illegal occupation and demanded a community vote to use all legal means necessary to remove me from the lake. She'd invited city councilmen, county commissioner, local press, and promised a presentation that would expose this threat to our community once and for all. Here's the legal nugget that saved me. False reporting to government agencies can result in criminal charges and civil liability. Always verify facts before filing official complaints. Linda was about to learn that lesson the hard way, in front of everyone who mattered. The community center was packed beyond capacity that Thursday evening. Over 100 residents filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension and the nervous energy of people who sensed they were about to witness something significant. Linda arrived in full battle dress, a designer navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, perfectly styled hair, and the confidence of someone who believed she was about to deliver a knockout punch. She'd brought visual aids, an easel with poster boards, a laptop for her presentation, and a stack of documents thick enough to use as a doorstop. The local newspaper reporter sat in the front row with her photographer. County Commissioner Sarah Rodriguez had driven in from the county seat. City Councilman Bradley Walsh, Linda's tennis partner, looked uncomfortable but present. Even a few folks from neighboring lake communities had shown up after hearing about the drama through the small-town gossip network. I arrived early and took a seat in the back, carrying nothing but a single manila folder and the quiet confidence that comes from holding all the cards. Linda took the podium like she was accepting an Academy Award. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're going to resolve a threat that's been hanging over our community for months. This illegal cabin operation has gone on long enough. Her PowerPoint presentation was a masterpiece of manipulation. Charts showing declining property values, photos of my cabin taken from angles that made it look like a condemned shack, dramatic quotes about community standards and protecting our investments. Mr. Morrison's so-called cabin violates dozens of current regulations and threatens everyone's property values. Tonight, I'm asking for your authorization to take immediate legal action to remove this blight from our lake. The crowd murmured agreement. Several residents voiced concerns about my aggressive tactics and refusal to cooperate with community standards. Linda's supporters were vocal and confident. Earl stood up from the middle section. Now hold on, Linda. Jake's grandfather built that cabin before any of us were even thinking about this lake. Some respect for history might be in order. History doesn't override property law, Earl, Linda snapped. We live in a modern community with modern standards. That's when County Commissioner Rodriguez asked the question that changed everything. Mr. Morrison, would you like to respond to these allegations? I stood up slowly, manila folder in hand, and made my way to the front. The room fell silent as I approached the podium. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and someone's nervous breathing in the front row. Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. I appreciate the opportunity to address some misconceptions. I opened my folder and pulled out a single document, the original 1994 development contract. I've recently discovered some interesting historical documents that I think everyone should hear about. Linda's face went pale as I placed the contract on the podium and adjusted the microphone. This is the original development agreement between my grandfather and Clearwater Development Corporation, dated March 15, 1994. It contains some provisions that might surprise people. I read the key clause slowly and clearly. Morrison family designee retains ownership and approval authority over all lake access structures, including but not limited to docks, boat slips, and water permits within the development boundaries. The silence was deafening. What this means, I continued, is that every dock permit in this community has been technically invalid for 30 years. Every boat slip rental, every dock fee, every water access right, all of it requires written approval from the Morrison family designee. That would be me. Linda erupted from her seat. Those are fake documents. This is fraud. Commissioner, you need to arrest this man immediately. Commissioner Rodriguez examined the contract with the careful attention of someone who'd seen a lot of legal documents in her career. Mr. Morrison, this appears to be authentic. These seals and signatures look legitimate. They are legitimate, I said calmly. I'm not here to hurt anyone or take anything away from this community. In fact, I've prepared an easement agreement that would grant permanent dock rights to all current residents. I pulled out the pre-written agreement. My only request is peaceful coexistence and an end to the harassment I've endured. I'd also like to propose that the dock fees currently being collected be redirected to a community lake conservation fund. Linda's complete meltdown was spectacular to witness. She screamed accusations at me, at the commissioner, at the reporter, even at her own supporters. This is a conspiracy! He forged those papers. Someone paid him to destroy our community. Security had to escort her out as she ranted about lawsuits and fraud and how people like him didn't belong in communities like ours. Her husband followed behind, apologizing to everyone within earshot. The community reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Residents lined up to shake my hand and apologize for Linda's behavior. HOA board members discussed her immediate resignation. The reporter interviewed me about my remarkable restraint and generous offer. I just want healing and cooperation, I told her, not revenge. The aftermath unfolded faster than a Michigan spring thaw. Linda's resignation from the HOA board was accepted unanimously at an emergency meeting held 3 days later. The new board president, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, issued a public apology to both me and the community for what she called months of unnecessary conflict and harassment. Within a week, I'd signed permanent easement agreements for every dock slip in the development. The legal dock fees, about $180,000 0 cents that Linda had collected over the years, were transferred to the newly established Lake Clearwater Conservation Fund. Finally, something positive came from all that drama. Linda's consequences kept mounting like compound interest. The county ethics investigation resulted in a $5,000 0 cents fine for attempted bribery of a public official. She was forced to pay my attorney fees, $12,000 0 cents, as part of the harassment settlement. Her husband's bank quietly transferred him to a branch 2 counties over to escape the scandal. Their house went up for sale within 6 months, with a sold sign appearing faster than anyone expected. Turns out, when you make that many enemies in a small community, fresh starts become attractive options. But this story isn't really about Linda's downfall. It's about what happened next. The first annual Grandfather Morrison Lake Cleanup Day brought out over 50 volunteers. We removed invasive species, restored native shoreline plants, and installed educational signs about lake ecosystem preservation. The Conservation Fund paid for everything, and the sense of community pride was something you could practically taste in the crisp morning air. Our fishing tournament raised $8,000 0 cents for a veteran's mental health program, something Grandpa would have loved, being a veteran himself. Local businesses donated prizes, and even some of Linda's former supporters rolled up their sleeves and helped with the barbecue. My cabin restoration became a symbol of what's possible when you honor history while building for the future. I completed the project using sustainable materials and traditional techniques, creating a retreat that feels like it's been part of the lake forever. The smell of cedar and pine, the sound of loons calling at dawn, the feel of solid craftsmanship under my hands, it was exactly what Grandpa intended. The conservation efforts attracted state-level attention, our water quality testing program won an Environmental Stewardship Award, and the lake became a model for community-led preservation efforts. Other waterfront communities started requesting my advice on balancing development with environmental protection. On a personal level, the experience taught me something unexpected about healing. My ex-wife reached out after reading about the situation in the newspaper, impressed by how I'd handled the conflict with dignity instead of bitterness. We're not getting back together, but we're talking again, which matters for our family. My grandson finally got that fishing lesson I'd promised. Watching him cast his first line from the same dock where 4 generations of Morrison men had learned the same skill, that moment was worth every minute of Linda's harassment. The taste of victory seasoned with family tradition was sweeter than any revenge. The Morrison Family Scholarship now provides $2,500 0 cents annually to local students pursuing environmental science degrees. 3 kids have received it so far, and their thank you letters sit proudly on my kitchen table next to Grandpa's old coffee mug. Property values in the community actually increased once the legal uncertainty was resolved. Several lots sold to buyers specifically attracted by our conservation leadership and community cooperation. The marinas business grew by 15% thanks to positive publicity and fishing guide referrals. Sometimes I sit on that dock at sunset, watching the water turn gold and feeling Grandpa's presence in the evening breeze. I realized that standing up for your principles doesn't just protect your own rights. It can strengthen an entire community when people see that bullies don't have to win. The old-timers still stop by for coffee and stories. Earl's become something of a local celebrity, always ready to tell anyone who'll listen about how patience and preparation beat bluster and intimidation. But here's the thing that makes me smile. Last month, a waterfront property owner from the next county over contacted me about an HOA dispute that sounds remarkably familiar. Apparently, their board president has been collecting fees for permits she doesn't actually control. Some people never learn. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA nightmare. I read every single one, and some of these stories are absolutely wild. If this story of standing up to petty tyrants resonated with you, smash that subscribe button because next week's story involves an HOA president who tried to foreclose on a disabled veteran's home and learned why you never mess with someone who knows explosives.